You can feel it when growth stops being lived and starts being displayed. The body still moves, the language still expands, the symbols still multiply, yet something inside feels rehearsed. It is the subtle moment when the inner work becomes a stage, and the stage begins to demand proof. What began as sincerity becomes a performance of sincerity, and the performance quietly replaces the original hunger. Most people do not choose this consciously. It happens through reward, through relief, through the intoxicating safety of being seen as evolved. When others nod, when others quote you, when others call you awakened, a new gravity forms around your image. You begin to protect the version of you that earns that response. You begin to fear the raw places that would contradict the brand you have built. There is a particular taste to performative growth. It tastes like urgency wrapped in certainty, like answers that arrive too quickly, like conclusions that never cost you anything. It feels clean, efficient, explained. It avoids the messy middle, the humiliating return, the season where the same lesson comes back with deeper teeth. It offers the comfort of progress without the risk of transformation. A part of you will protest right here and say that this is harsh, that visibility can be honest, that teaching can be service. That is true, but it is not the point. The point is the internal shift where your compass stops listening to what is true and starts listening to what looks true. When the need to be correct becomes louder than the need to be real, growth becomes a product. This is how spiritual performance begins, not with lies, but with a small trade. You trade direct contact with your own confusion for the approval of coherence. You trade the slow intelligence of your nervous system for the fast intelligence of concepts. You trade the living edge for a curated identity that never breaks on camera. And the more refined that identity becomes, the harder it is to admit what it cannot hold. You will notice it first in your language. Words become polished shields, not tools of contact. You speak in conclusions instead of observations, and you speak in symbols instead of sensations. You begin to narrate your healing while skipping the actual feeling. The story remains inspiring, but you can no longer find yourself inside it. Another part of you will insist that naming things is clarity, that frameworks protect you from chaos. That objection is intelligent, and it can still become a trap. Frameworks can guide, but they can also anesthetize. The moment you use structure to avoid the trembling unknown, you are not stabilizing, you are escaping. There is a difference between integration and presentation. Integration is quiet. It changes how you breathe, how you choose, how you treat what irritates you. Presentation is loud. It changes your vocabulary, your aesthetic, your posture, your claims. Integration makes you more available to life, while presentation makes you more defended against being exposed. One creates humility, the other creates a costume that pretends to be humility. This is why performative growth often looks advanced. It is optimized. It is clean. It is always explainable. It has no gaps that would allow someone to doubt your authority. But real growth has gaps because reality has gaps, and the self must learn to stand inside them without rushing to fill them. The spiral does not punish gaps, it uses them. You may feel resistance here because you have worked hard to become articulate, and articulation has helped you survive. You may fear that if you stop narrating your evolution, you will regress into silence or confusion. That fear is understandable, but it confuses the map with the territory. The territory does not vanish when you stop describing it. Sometimes it finally becomes audible. Performative growth creates a strange kind of exhaustion. You can meditate, journal, cleanse, affirm, and still feel hollow. You can receive synchronicities and still feel disconnected. You can speak about frequency and still feel brittle. That is because the engine driving the process is no longer life. It is maintenance. You are maintaining an identity called growth, and identity maintenance always drains. Notice how quickly performance needs results. It needs the next upgrade, the next label, the next activation. It does not tolerate seasons of stillness, because stillness does not prove anything to anyone. It does not tolerate relapse, because relapse damages the storyline. A part of you will argue that discipline is required, that commitment matters, that consistency is virtue. Yes, but discipline is different from compulsion. Commitment is different from fear of being seen as stagnant. Consistency is different from repetition used to avoid the next layer of truth. The question is not whether you practice. The question is who you are trying to convince through practice. When growth becomes performance, the inner world becomes a court. Thoughts present arguments. Feelings present evidence. Intuition gets cross-examined, and the body gets dismissed as unreliable. You begin to treat discomfort as an error instead of information. You begin to treat uncertainty as a flaw instead of a doorway. You begin to seek spiritual correctness, and spiritual correctness is not awakening, it is control. There is also the hidden economy of spiritual performance. Every identity has a currency, and the currency here is perceived evolution. People pay you in praise, attention, trust, and sometimes money. None of these are inherently corrupt, but they change the pressure inside your system. They make it costly to admit confusion. They make it costly to revise a belief. They make it costly to say that something you once taught no longer holds. You may feel the objection rising again, because you may be building something that requires consistency, a body of work, a lineage, a message. The fear is that if you allow honest contradiction, everything collapses. But the deeper truth is harsher and kinder at the same time. If your message cannot survive your honesty, then your message was built on performance. If it can survive, then you have found something living. This is the first vector the spiral will press on. Motive. Not motive as morality, but motive as physics. What is the force pushing your growth forward? And what happens if the audience disappears? If nobody sees you, do you still choose the work? If nobody praises you, do you still listen inward? If nobody asks for your wisdom, do you still respect your unhealed edges? The second vector is consequence. Performance makes you more certain, but less free. It makes you more respected, but less intimate with yourself. It makes you more impressive, but less capable of tenderness. It often makes you spiritually loud while emotionally unavailable. Eventually, someone close to you feels it, because they do not need your message. They need your presence. Watch how performative growth handles conflict. It uses teachings as weapons or shields. It spiritualizes the other person, diagnoses them, elevates itself. It refuses vulnerability by calling vulnerability low vibration. It refuses repair by calling repair attachment. It refuses accountability by calling accountability judgment. This is not awakening. It is avoidance wearing sacred clothing. A part of you might want to defend your knowledge right now, because you have seen real distortion and you have fought your way out of it. That fight matters, but when knowledge becomes armor, you begin to lose the soft power that actually heals. You begin to prefer being right over being reachable. You begin to prefer being perceived as wise over being truthful in a raw moment. The third vector is embodiment. Performance lives in the mind and in the image. Embodiment lives in the breath and in the choices made when no one is watching. It lives in the way you respond to boredom, in the way you meet your own jealousy without disguising it. If your teachings do not show up in your daily nervous system, then your teachings are still a costume. This is where the spiral becomes uncomfortable. It does not accept a luminous vocabulary used to bypass basic honesty. It will keep returning you to the places you tried to transcend prematurely. It will keep bringing the unfinished material back, not as punishment, but as proof that you are still alive. So how do you know when growth is becoming performance? You know because you start choosing what keeps the story intact. You start choosing what keeps you admired. You start choosing what keeps you consistent with the persona. And you start hiding the moments that would reveal your humanity, even to yourself, which is the most dangerous hiding of all. The correction is not to abandon expression or teaching or visibility. The correction is to stop letting visibility set the direction of your inner life. Let the inner life set the direction, and let visibility become secondary, almost incidental. Tell the truth at the speed you can live it, not at the speed that earns applause. Speak from the place that risks being misunderstood, because that place is usually real. And do not be surprised when the spiral asks power where you no longer need to prove that you are evolving. When you can feel that request without immediately wrapping it in language, you will know the performance is breaking and the living work is returning. The most deceptive part of performative growth is that it can be sincere and still be false. The heart can want God and still be chasing applause. The soul can want truth and still be addicted to being seen as someone who has it. This is why the correction is not a purge of spirituality or a rejection of language. The correction is a return to what cannot be performed, because it is too private to display and too costly to fake. When growth becomes performance, you begin to experience yourself as a project. Every feeling becomes a prompt. Every disruption becomes content. Every wound becomes a lesson you must deliver quickly. Because the moment you sit inside it without packaging it, you feel exposed. You begin to measure your inner life by how teachable it is, not by how true it is. And then you wonder why the sacred feels thin. Because you turned your altar into a stage. A voice inside will argue that this is simply modern life, that everything is shared, that connection requires expression. There is truth in that. But the spiral asks a sharper question. Does expression arise from fullness, or does it arise from hunger? Does sharing come after integration, or does sharing replace integration? Because the moment the audience becomes part of the processing becomes contaminated by the need to be understood. The spiral reveals performance through a simple symptom. You start needing your growth to make sense. You start needing clean arcs, linear progress, a coherent identity. But reality is not coherent at the pace the ego demands, and the soul does not evolve in straight lines. Real movement often looks like collapse, repetition, delay, and contradiction. When you refuse those shapes, you do not become more evolved, you become more edited. There is also a more hidden symptom. Performative growth makes you less curious. Curiosity is dangerous to performance, because curiosity might undo your conclusions. Curiosity might force you to admit you were wrong. Curiosity might make you change your language, and changing language threatens brand consistency. So you begin to avoid questions that could soften your certainty. You call that stability, you call that mastery. But it is fear wearing robes. This is why a spiritual persona often hardens over time. It becomes less alive, less playful, less receptive. It becomes a fortress built out of refined concepts. It looks like calm, but the calm is maintained, not embodied. It looks like confidence, but the confidence is defended, and the one maintaining it is tired because defense is expensive. Another internal objection rises here. You may say that you have done real work, that you have faced your shadows, that you have earned your clarity. That is likely true, but the spiral does not deny your progress. It tests its freedom. Can your clarity survive humility? Can your insight survive a season where you do not know? Can your identity survive being revised? If the answer is no, then the clarity is not stable, it is a cage. The spiral also exposes performance through relationships. When you are performing growth, you unconsciously seek people who validate your narrative. You avoid people who challenge your image. You avoid the friend who sees through your spiritual tone and speaks to the raw human underneath. You avoid intimacy that requires you to stop teaching and start feeling. And then you call your loneliness sovereignty, even though it is partly avoidance. This does not mean solitude is wrong. In your world, solitude has always been a sacred flame, a chosen path that protects your signal, but performance can mimic that same path and corrupt it. It can turn sacred solitude into curated distance. It can turn discernment into superiority. It can turn quiet into insulation. The spiral asks you to tell the difference not by concept, but by sensation. Does your solitude make you more honest, or does it make you more defended? Performance also distorts the way you interpret pain. Pain becomes a threat to your narrative, so you try to transmute it too quickly. You skip the grief and rush into meaning. You skip the anger and rush into forgiveness. You skip the humiliation and rush into perspective. You call this spiritual maturity, but it is often fear of being seen as unfinished. The spiral does not glorify pain, but it does not allow you to outrun it. It makes pain intelligible by forcing you to stay close enough to hear what it is saying. This is where many false awakenings form. A false awakening is not a lie. It is an insight used as an exit. You touch something real, and then you use that touch to justify leaving your body. You use it to justify leaving your emotions. You use it to justify leaving accountability. You become a witness of life instead of a participant. You begin to float above the ordinary. You feel high, but the high is dissociation refined into doctrine. A deeper objection will rise now, because you know there is a witnessing awareness that is real. You know there is a quiet space that sees without drowning. That is also true. But witnessing is not meant to replace life. It is meant to clarify it. If your witnessing makes you less available to love, less available to repair, less available to the messy needs of a human day, then it is not liberation. It is escape. The spiral measures awakening by contact, not by distance. So the question becomes practical. What do you do when you realize you have been performing? You do not punish yourself. Punishment is still performance because it keeps the ego at the center. You also do not confess publicly to cleanse your image, because confession can become a new performance. The spiral asks for a quieter correction. It asks you to remove the audience from your inner work for a season, even if the audience is imaginary, because the imaginary audience is often the real one. You can be alone and still be performing, because the mind is projecting a watcher. It is projecting the future comment section. It is projecting the people you want to impress. It is projecting the people you fear. It is projecting the old authority that judged you. Performance is not always external. It is often an internal tribunal that never shuts up. You begin dismantling it by practicing unrecorded truth. Speak sentences you will never share. Admit contradictions without solving them. Let yourself be messy with no narrative reward. Sit with an emotion without turning it into a lesson. Feel the impulse to post, to teach, to explain, and instead ask what you are trying to regulate by being seen. Because many people post not to share truth, but to relieve tension. They use visibility as nervous system management. That is where the spiral turns the knife gently. It makes you look at the economy beneath your spiritual habits. It asks what each habit is buying you. Does meditation buy you contact? Or does it buy you status? Does study buy you understanding? Or does it buy you an identity called knowledgeable? Does service buy you love? Or does it buy you control? The habit itself is not the issue. The hidden transaction is. And there is one transaction that almost no one wants to admit. Sometimes spirituality becomes a way to avoid ordinary failure. If you feel powerless in the practical world, it is tempting to become powerful in the metaphysical world. If you feel unseen in daily life, it is tempting to become seen as a guide. If you feel uncertain about your worth, it is tempting to become certain about your mission. None of this makes you evil. It makes you human. But if you do not see it, it will drive you. This is why performative growth often includes grand certainty. The certainty is not always spiritual arrogance. Sometimes it is compensation. A fragile self seeks a strong narrative. A wounded self seeks a cosmic role. A lonely self seeks a destined path. The spiral does not mock this. It simply refuses to let destiny replace healing. It refuses to let mission replace maturity. It refuses to let narrative replace truth. If you are honest, you can feel the exact moment performance took over. It was the moment being seen felt safer than being felt. It was the moment concepts felt easier than emotions. It was the moment coherence felt more valuable than intimacy. It was the moment you started editing your experience while still calling it transformation. And if you can locate that moment, you can reverse it. Reversal does not mean losing your voice. It means changing what your voice serves. When your voice serves the audience, you become a performer. When your voice serves the truth, you become a transmitter. A transmitter does not need to be believed. A transmitter does not need to be admired. A transmitter does not need a clean arc. A transmitter needs contact. And contact is always slightly uncomfortable because it cannot be staged. So let the spiral test you in a way that performance cannot pass. Let it test you through the ordinary. How do you handle irritation when no one is watching? How do you handle boredom without turning it into a spiritual lesson? How do you handle jealousy without dressing it as discernment? How do you handle shame without calling it low vibration? The real path is hidden in these unglamorous moments, and performance hates them because they cannot be aesthetic. You will also be tested through silence again, but not the silence of abandonment. The silence of no feedback. The silence of not knowing whether you are growing. The silence of not being validated. Performance will panic in that silence and try to manufacture signs. It will try to force synchronicities. It will try to demand confirmation. But the spiral uses that silence to restore your inner authority. It teaches you to move without applause. And there is a final pressure point that reveals everything. Performance cannot tolerate being wrong. It can tolerate being misunderstood, because misunderstanding still centers the image. But being wrong threatens the identity at its root. So it avoids revision. It avoids apology. It avoids returning to a past teaching and saying it was incomplete. But the spiral is built on revision. It is built on the living truth that evolves, and the one who refuses revision becomes frozen. So if you want a simple diagnostic that does not flatter you, here it is. Are you willing to be corrected by life? Are you willing to change your mind publicly if needed? Are you willing to lose a label that once saved you? Are you willing to disappoint the audience that loved your certainty? Because if you can do those things, you are not performing growth. You are living it. And if you cannot yet, then the spiral will keep pressing, not to humiliate you, but to free you from the need to appear free. If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.